The Svensson boy came through the door of Ingeborg Dahl's cabin at 9:30 on the morning of January 14th without knocking, which told her everything she needed to know about how bad it had gotten next door before she saw his face. He was 7 years old, and he had been running in -22-degree air, which was a thing children did when they were frightened enough to forget that running in that temperature was the kind of mistake adults corrected by example. His eyelashes were white. The scarf his mother had wrapped around his face had slipped, and the exposed patch of skin across his left cheekbone had gone pale in a way that was not good. Ingeborg was already on her feet. She said, "How long were you outside?" He said, "From our door to your door." She said, "Straight across." He nodded. Tears were beginning in the corners of his eyes. Whether from the cold or the fear he had been carrying, she could not tell yet. She said, "How long has your father's fire been out?" He said, "Since last night. He tried to start it this morning, but the flint—" She had already turned away from him and was pulling her coat from the hook by the door. She turned back and looked at his cheekbone. She said, "Hold still." She pressed the heel of her warm hand against the pale patch and kept it there for 30 seconds, feeling the cold in his skin against her palm, watching the color begin to come back. She said, "You did right to come straight here. You did not stop." He said no. She said, "Go stand by the stove. Do not go back outside." She went out into the -22 air and crossed the 40 feet of packed snow between her cabin door and the Svensson door, and was inside before 30 seconds had passed. And even 30 seconds in that air was an education in what January in Wisconsin Territory thought of human plans. Lars Svensson was at his hearth with the flint and striker, working with the particular focused desperation of a man who had been at it for 2 hours and understood with complete clarity what 2 hours of no fire in this temperature meant for 4 children and a wife. The flint had cracked somewhere in the night, a hairline fracture that made the edge unpredictable, throwing sparks wide instead of true. The tinder bundle in his hand had taken 3 near catches and given up all 3. His wife, Britta, sat on the edge of the sleeping platform with the youngest child wrapped inside her coat, the child's face pressed against her chest, her own face the expression of a woman who was managing the arithmetic of what happened next. The cabin temperature was 31 degrees. Ingeborg did not say anything about the flint or the fire or the 31 degrees. She said, "Come next door, all of you. Now." Lars started to say something about the cow in the animal pen on the cabin's east end, an enclosure built against the exterior wall that housed the Svenssons' single milk cow and 4 chickens. Ingeborg said, "Bring the cow too." She took them next door, all 6 of them, through the 40 feet of -22 air, with the children wrapped in every layer they owned, and Lars carrying the cow at a shuffling run that was undignified and necessary. And she got them inside her cabin and shut the door. Her cabin was 56 degrees. Britta Svensson stood in the entrance and felt the warmth hit her face and closed her eyes for a moment. Lars looked at the thermometer Ingeborg kept on the south wall and then looked at Ingeborg and said nothing, which was more eloquent than anything he could have said. There were now 8 people and a cow in Ingeborg Dahl's cabin, plus her own 2 pigs and the chickens she already had in the east enclosure. The cabin was a standard Wisconsin Territory frame construction, 16 by 20 feet, with a good iron stove and 2 cords of split oak standing under the lean-to outside. It was built for 2 people. With 8 people and a livestock population, it was going to be a day of creative management. It was also going to be the day that Ingeborg finally showed Lars Svensson and his wife and their 4 children what she had been trying to explain since September. She had spent all autumn trying to explain it to 4 different families and had been told, with varying degrees of tact depending on the family, that her idea was impractical, unnecessary, un-American, and, from the Halverson claim to the north, a little peculiar for a widow woman living alone to be proposing. She explained it now, while Britta nursed the youngest, and Lars sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a cup of hot coffee, and the older Svensson children spread themselves across the warm floor with the unself-conscious gratitude of children who had been cold and were now not, from the position of having 8 people in a cabin designed for 2 in -22 air, with 3 more families in the settlement whose fires were consuming wood at rates that would exhaust their supplies. By February, what she proposed was this. The 4 claims in the eastern section of the Ridge Creek settlement were arranged in a rough square, each claim bordering the next, the 4 cabin sites within 400 feet of each other, one at each corner of an imaginary square drawn on the Wisconsin Territory prairie. The Dahl cabin at the southwest, the Svensson cabin at the northwest, the Anderson cabin at the northeast, the Halverson cabin at the southeast. She wanted to connect them. Not immediately, not all at once, but in a specific sequence using a design she had thought through since August. Since the summer, her brother-in-law had written from Norway, describing how his grandfather's farmstead in the Telemark Valley had been arranged, a cluster of interconnected structures sharing walls, sharing heat, sharing the thermal buffer of the spaces between the inhabited rooms. The Norwegian tradition of the Gårdsanlag, the farm cluster that was architecturally one thing even when it housed several families, connected by enclosed corridors and shared animal spaces that served as thermal buffers between the living quarters and the outside world. The principle was this: a cabin with 4 exterior walls lost heat through all 4 walls simultaneously. A cabin sharing 1 wall with an adjacent structure lost heat through only 3 walls, because the shared wall was interior rather than exterior, protected on both sides from the January air. 2 cabins sharing a wall each had 3 exterior walls instead of 4. The heat loss reduction was not small. It was the difference between a fire that kept up with the cold and a fire that fell behind it. More than that, the connecting structure between the cabins, a corridor or vestibule even 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, was a thermal buffer. The corridor air, heated by proximity to both cabins' heat, stayed at 20 to 30 degrees above the outside air temperature, even without its own fire source. A person moving from one cabin to the other moved through a warm transition space rather than through -22 air. Firewood could be moved, children could be moved, sick family members could be moved between the 4 households without exposure to the killing cold outside. Lars Svensson looked at her across the table. He had heard this in September and had thought it was a fine idea for a woman with no husband and too much time to think. He had heard it in October when she brought the sketch she had made, a top-down drawing of the 4 claim sites with lines between them showing the proposed corridors. He had thought it was an interesting drawing. He had thought November would be the right time to start construction if they were going to do it. November had come, and he had been finishing his animal enclosure, and his woodpile was not as large as he had planned, and the first cold snap had come earlier than expected, and then his wife had been ill for 2 weeks, and then December had been mild enough that the urgency had faded, and then January had come, and the flint had cracked. He was sitting in 56-degree warmth with his children on the floor, and his wife's color returning, and he looked at Ingeborg Dahl and said, "How long would it take to build the corridor?" She said, "Between our 2 cabins. With 3 men working and the weather allowing 1 week." He said, "What does it cost?" She said, "Lumber for the frame, if we don't have enough salvage. Chinking material. The materials are not the obstacle." He said, "What is the obstacle?" She said, "Convincing the Andersons and the Halversons." He looked at the thermometer. He said, "I'll talk to Anders Anderson today." She said, "Wait until tomorrow. Today you warm your family. Tomorrow the temperature is supposed to rise to 10 above, and Anders can be approached when he's not actively managing a crisis." Lars nodded. He drank his coffee. He looked at his oldest daughter, who was lying on the warm floor with her eyes half closed. the animal warmth of a child who has been cold and is now safe, and the body is processing the relief. He looked at his wife nursing the youngest, with her shawl loose now, the warmth having reached her in the 10 minutes since they arrived. He said, "If I had built the corridor in November, this morning would have been different." Ingeborg said, "Yes." He said, "How different?" She said, "Your flint broke and your fire went out. That happens. If the corridor existed, you would have walked through an enclosed warm space to come here, and your children would not have run through -22 air. The situation would still have required a solution, but the solution would not have required running." He thought about the Svensson boy's eyelashes when he came through the door. He thought about the pale patch on his cheekbone. He said, "We build it in the spring. Full construction, all 4 cabins connected." She said, "Spring is not possible. Spring construction for use next winter is the right timeline. But that means we need agreement from all 4 families before the spring thaw, which means winter negotiations, which means this week." He said, "Why this week?" She said, "Because every family in the eastern section is going to be below their comfortable fuel threshold by February, and everyone knows it. But no one is saying it out loud yet. The window for convincing people to prepare together, rather than each managing their own shortage, is the window between knowing and denying. This week is that window." Lars Svensson looked at her for a long moment. He had known Ingeborg Dahl for 2 years, since she arrived in Ridge Creek settlement with her wagon and her tools, and her dead husband's claim papers, and her particular way of looking at problems from the angle that other people had not looked from yet. He had thought her capable and somewhat relentless and occasionally right about things before other people were. He said, "You have been thinking about this all winter." She said, "I have been thinking about this since the summer my husband died, and I was the only person on the Dahl claim, and I spent the first winter burning twice the wood I needed because I had a full 4-wall cabin, losing heat from all 4 sides for the benefit of one person." He absorbed this. He said, "You need a partner to share the wall." She said, "I need 3 partners. I need the full cluster. 1 shared wall helps. 2 shared walls helps more. All 4 cabins connected into a single structure is a different category of problem altogether. An enclosed courtyard, corridors on all 4 sides, the livestock spaces inside the envelope. When it is complete, the wind hits the exterior of the cluster and the interior is protected. The fire in each cabin heats its own space and contributes to the shared corridors, and the shared corridors contribute back to all 4 cabins." He said, "Has anyone built this here before?" She said, "Not in Wisconsin territory. In Norway, this is how farms have been built for 300 years in the mountain valleys. My brother-in-law described it to me in his letter. He walked me through the principle. I understood why it worked." Lars Svensson folded his hands around the coffee cup and looked at his children on the warm floor and said nothing for a minute. Then he said, "The Halversons will not want to share a wall with anyone." She said, "No. Eric Halverson will say it is a violation of his claim independence. He will say it creates legal complications if one family needs to leave. He will say the connecting structure is a weak point in both buildings." He said, "Is he right about any of it?" She said, "He is right about the legal question if we do not document the agreement properly. He is wrong about the weak point, because a shared interior wall is structurally stronger than a freestanding exterior wall. And he is wrong about the claim independence, because claim independence during a winter where 4 families are sharing firewood and childcare and crisis management is a fiction that the January temperature is going to dismantle one family at a time." He said, "Tell him that." She said, "I will tell him a different version of that, which will be more likely to produce a yes than the direct version." He looked at her. He said, "You have planned this conversation too." She said, "I have planned all 4 conversations. I have planned them since October when I understood that September's conversations had not worked. Lars was quiet. Then he said, with the particular tone of a man who had just understood something he had been adjacent to for a while, "You were not making proposals in September. You were gathering information." She said, "I was doing both. The proposals were real, but yes. Each conversation told me something about what the next conversation needed to say." He looked at his wife. Britta was listening, had been listening since the beginning, from behind the nursing child and the shawl. She met Lars's eyes and gave the slight nod of a woman who had formed her own opinion and was confirming it. Lars said, "What do you need from me today?" She said, "Let your children sleep on my floor. Use my firewood. When your fire is going again tomorrow and your children are warm in your own cabin, tell me what you tell your wife when you are both alone and you are thinking about February." He said, "I'll tell you that tonight." She nodded. She poured him more coffee. She went to check on the Svensson cow, which had been given the corner of the animal enclosure and was managing the situation with the practical indifference of a cow who understood that warmth was warmth regardless of whose cabin it was in. Ingeborg had come to the Ridge Creek settlement in the spring of 1851 with her husband Peder and the particular clear-eyed optimism of people who had planned their immigration carefully and saved for it carefully and chosen their destination carefully. Peder was a carpenter and a farmer, a combination that was almost as useful on the Wisconsin Territory frontier as any combination a person could bring. Ingeborg was the daughter of a man who had managed a cooperage in Christiania for 20 years, which meant she had grown up understanding how physical structures worked, how materials behaved under stress and temperature, how the design of a container determined what it could and could not hold. Peder had been dead for 3 years. He had died in the second summer, a fever that came on fast and took him in 8 days. He was 41 years old. He left Ingeborg the cabin, the 40 acres of broken ground, the tools, and a winter she had not planned to face alone. She had faced it. She had burned through most of the wood he had cut that summer, cutting more herself as the winter progressed, with the 2-man crosscut saw she used alone, the way she used everything now, more slowly than with 2, but adequately. She had arrived at spring with what she needed to keep going, and a specific understanding, earned at the cost of 200 armloads of cordwood, that a single-person household in a 4-wall cabin was a profoundly inefficient arrangement. The inefficiency was not about labor, though labor was part of it. It was about physics. A cabin, designed for a family of 4 or 5 people housed, in addition to those people, the heat those people generated simply by occupying the space, breathing and moving and sleeping and cooking. A single person generated a fraction of that heat. The cabin still had 4 walls, losing heat in all 4 directions, but the interior heat source was reduced to 1 person's body heat, plus whatever the fire provided. The fire had to do the entire job that a fire in a full household shared with the household. She had calculated roughly that a full household of 5 people in a cabin, her size, required perhaps 30% less firewood to maintain the same interior temperature as she required alone. 30% was not a small difference. Over a Wisconsin Territory winter, 30% was a cord and a half of wood. 3 weeks of cutting, the difference between barely enough and adequately enough. The solution was not to acquire a family, which was the solution most people assumed a widow in her situation would pursue. The solution was to redesign the thermal envelope. She had thought about this through the second winter, and by the third winter, which was the winter of 1853 to 1854, she had a design. The design came from the letter her brother-in-law had written about the Telemark farmstead, which had given her the architectural image, and from the understanding of thermal physics she had built from 2 winters of careful observation and a memory full of her father's explanations of what made a good barrel, which were the same principles at a different scale. A barrel held its contents because it was a complete envelope. Every stave contributed to the seal. A barrel with a gap in its stave was not a defective barrel that needed to be replaced. It was a barrel that needed the gap filled. The Ridge Creek settlement had 4 families in a rough square formation, 4 staves of a barrel that was almost complete. The gaps between the cabins were the gaps between the staves. Fill the gaps, and the envelope was complete. She had the design sketched before the summer of 1853 was over. The design was not complicated. 4 cabins in their existing positions, each housing 1 family. Between the Dahl cabin and the Svensson cabin to the north, a corridor 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, timber-framed with log walls and a sod roof, creating an enclosed transition space. Between the Svensson cabin and the Anderson cabin to the east, another corridor of the same dimensions. Between the Anderson cabin and the Halverson cabin to the south, the same. Between the Halverson cabin and the Dahl cabin to the west, the same. The 4 corridors creating a roughly square enclosed courtyard in the center, approximately 40 feet across. The courtyard was the key element. Enclosed on all 4 sides by corridors connecting inhabited cabins, the courtyard air would be sheltered from the direct wind by the surrounding structure. With a simple overhead covering of poles and sod, the courtyard could be used as a central gathering space, a work area, and, critically, as shared livestock housing. The animal heat from 4 families' livestock concentrated in the enclosed courtyard would provide a constant low-level heat source at the center of the structure, warming all 4 corridors from the interior rather than requiring each family to heat their own animal space independently. The total reduction in exterior wall surface area was significant. Each cabin currently had 4 exterior walls. After connection, each cabin would have 2 exterior walls and 2 interior walls connecting to corridors. The 2 interior walls lost virtually no heat to the outside. Each family's fire needed to do half the envelope work it currently did. The total fuel savings across 4 families she estimated at 40 to 50%. 4 families currently burning an average of 7 cord of wood per winter would collectively burn between 14 and 16 cord rather than 28. The savings in labor alone, the cutting and hauling and splitting that the cordwood reduction represented, was weeks of recovered time per family per year. She had explained this in September to Lars Svensson, who had been interested, but not urgent. She had explained it to Anders Anderson, who had been politely skeptical and had asked several reasonable questions about structural integrity and who owned the corridor wall once it was built. She had explained it to Erik Halverson, who had listened with his arms crossed and said it was a Norwegian idea and he was not Norwegian and he would think about it. None of them had done anything with the information. Now Lars Svensson was sitting in her cabin in January with his children on her floor, and she had a different tool than September's proposals. She had January itself. She let Lars use the cabin for 2 days while his flint was replaced and his fire was restored to reliable operation. On the 2nd day, the temperature rose to 12 above, which was survivable for the time required to walk between claims. She went to the Anderson claim first, because Anders was the easier of the 2 remaining conversations. Anders Anderson was a careful man, Danish by birth, who had been in the territory for 4 years and had developed the frontier farmer's particular relationship with preparation, which was a deep faith in it, combined with the perpetual knowledge that you had not done quite enough of it. He was at his woodpile when Ingeborg arrived, stacking the remaining supply and counting it in the way a person counted things when they were not sure they wanted to know the answer. She said, "How much do you have left?" He said, 4 cord, maybe a little less. She said, "Through when?" He looked at the sky. He said, "Mid-February if the cold holds. If it breaks in late January, I'm fine." She said, "The cold is not breaking in late January." He looked at her. He said, "You don't know that." She said, I have 3 winters of temperature records from this claim. The mean February temperature in Ridge Creek is consistently below the mean January temperature. February is colder than January, usually by 4 to 8 degrees over the month. If you have 4 cord for mid-February, you have a problem by the end of February. He said nothing for a moment. He went back to stacking. She said, Lars Svensson's fire went out yesterday morning. His family spent the night at 31 degrees before they came to me. Anders stopped stacking. She said his flint cracked. That's a solvable problem. But the solution required his 7-year-old to run 40 feet through -22 air to my door, and now the child's cheekbone needed an hour of warming. He turned around. He said, The boy is all right. She said, He is all right. He would have been all right if the corridor existed. He would have walked through an enclosed warm passage and knocked on an interior door. Anders was quiet. He looked at the woodpile. He looked toward the Svensson claim in the northwest. He said, When do you want to start? She said, Spring thaw. Full construction, all 4 cabins. I need your agreement today, and I need you to come with me to the Halvorsen claim tomorrow. He said, Why tomorrow? She said, Because Erik Halvorsen says no when he feels like he is the last one being asked. He says yes, or at least maybe, when he understands that a decision has already been made, and the question is whether he is part of it. Anders looked at her for a long moment. He was thinking in the way a careful man thought, through the legal question she had anticipated, the structural question, the practical implications for his family across a winter that was going to be, his woodpile was telling him, significantly harder than he had planned. He said, Who owns the corridor wall? She said, Both of the families it connects, equally, by written agreement drawn up before construction begins. The agreement specifies that neither family can alter or remove their half of the shared wall without the other's written consent, and that if a family leaves the claim, the corridor structure becomes the property of the remaining family, who must maintain it or remove it at their own expense. He looked at her. He said, You have a draft of this agreement already. She said, I do. He said, You wrote it in the summer. She said, Yes. He shook his head slowly, not in refusal but in the kind of slow recognition a person had when they realized that someone had been 10 steps ahead of the conversation since before the conversation started. He said, Show me the agreement. She showed it to him the following morning, on the walk to the Halvorsen claim with both of them, which was the choreography she had planned. Erik Halvorsen was splitting wood in his yard when they arrived. He looked at the 2 of them approaching together, and the calculation he performed was visible in the slight change of his posture before his expression caught up with it. He understood immediately that a decision had taken shape without him, that Ingeborg and Lars and now Anders had arrived at something and were coming to tell him what it was, not to ask him. He was 44 years old, broad and deliberate, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had built a good claim through pure individual effort and who viewed collaborative arrangements with the suspicion of someone who had never needed one. He said, What? Ingeborg said, We're going to connect the 4 cabins this spring. Lars and Anders have agreed. I'm bringing you the terms. Erik said, You're bringing me the terms. She said, Yes. He set the splitting axe aside. He said, I have not agreed to anything. She said, No, you haven't. That is why I am here. He looked at Anders. He looked at the direction of the Svensson claim. He said, Lars Svensson's fire went out 2 days ago. She said, Yes. He said, His family. She said, All well. They spent 2 days at my cabin. He was quiet. He picked up the axe again, not to split anything, but to have something in his hands, which was a habit people had when they were thinking through something they did not want to be seen thinking through. He said, The corridor between my claim and the Halvorsen, between my claim and Andersen's claim, who owns it? She said, You and Anders equally, by written agreement. I have a draft. Nothing is finalized. everything is negotiable before construction begins. He said, and if I decide to sell the claim in 5 years and the new family does not want the corridor? She said, the agreement specifies that any sale transfers the corridor agreement to the new owner as a condition of the sale, the same as any other structural element of the claim. A buyer who doesn't want the corridor pays to have it removed at their expense. A buyer who wants the corridor has it at no cost. He split a log, he split another. He was doing arithmetic that was not about the corridor ownership, she could tell, but about something else, something less architectural and more personal that he was working toward from the back. He said, my wife has been cold every winter since we came here. Ingeborg said nothing. He said, the youngest cannot sleep in the back room after November. We move her to the main room with the stove. The back room is 40 degrees in the cold snaps. She said, a shared wall between your cabin and the corridor would eliminate the back room cold. The corridor air, heated by proximity to both cabins, holds 25 to 30 degrees above outside temperature without its own fire source. He said, the back room shares the east wall. She said, the east wall is the one that connects to the Anderson corridor. Yes. He split another log. He said, 4 families, 1 winter. She said, more than 1 winter, every winter. He was quiet for long enough that she understood he had reached a decision and was simply letting it settle before speaking. He said, I want to look at the agreement before I say yes. She said, come by this evening. I'll have it on the table. He came that evening. He read the agreement with the specific attention of a man who had learned to read legal documents by reading bad ones first. He asked 6 questions, 4 of which she had anticipated and 2 of which she had not. The 2 she had not anticipated were about the courtyard roof ownership, which she agreed was an oversight in the draft, and about the process for adding a 5th or 6th family to the structure in future, which she had not considered because she had been focused on the 4 existing families. She said, you are right that the courtyard roof needs its own ownership clause. We will add it. For future expansion, let me think about the mechanism and bring it back to you. He said, you had not thought about expansion. She said, I had not. You should have been in September's conversations. He looked at the agreement. He looked at her. He said, why weren't you this direct in September? She said, in September, I did not have January yet. January is more persuasive than I am. He signed the agreement. She signed below him. She went to the Svensson and Anderson claims the next morning with 2 copies, and both families signed. Construction began in April. As soon as the ground was workable, she had spent the winter drawing detailed plans, not the rough sketch she had used for the September conversations, but proper construction drawings, the kind her father had made for cooperage equipment, dimensioned and sequenced, and showing the structural logic of each joint and connection. She had drawn the south corridor first, the one between her cabin and the Halverson claim, because it was the longest at 18 feet, and the most structurally demanding given the distance between the 2 cabin sites. Lars Svensson was the most willing worker, but the least skilled. Anders Anderson was methodical and careful, and once he understood a task, he executed it precisely. Erik Halverson was the best builder of the 3 men, which she had expected from the quality of his existing cabin construction, and once he had committed to the project, he brought his full attention to it without reservation. She directed the construction. She was not above asking them to do work differently when they did it wrong, which she did twice with Lars and once with Erik, and in each case she explained the reason clearly enough that the correction produced understanding rather than resentment. The north corridor between her cabin and the Svensson claim went up in 8 days. It was 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, with log walls and a sod roof over willow poles, the same construction as any small outbuilding on any frontier claim. The critical elements were the door openings, which she specified at 30 inches wide rather than the standard 24, because people moved through corridors carrying children and firewood and food, and the narrow door was an obstacle at the moments when obstacle was most costly. The log walls of the corridor connected to the existing cabin walls with notched joints, the corridor logs overlapping the cabin corner logs in the alternating pattern that made the connection structurally integral rather than merely adjacent. She had explained this to Eric, whose initial plan had been to simply butt the corridor walls against the existing cabin walls and nail them, which would have worked in mild weather and failed under the lateral forces of a winter storm. He listened to her explanation and rebuilt the connection point correctly. The east and west corridors went up through May, the Anderson connecting to Svensson in the northeast and Anderson to Halvorsen in the southeast. Each corridor took 7 to 9 days, with the full 4-person crew working, the 3 men building and Ingeborg directing, measuring, and filling chinking gaps in the finished sections. The courtyard was the last element. She had designed it as a simple pole and sod structure, not a full log building, but a covered space with 4-foot walls that blocked the wind and a sod roof on willow poles that provided overhead shelter. The floor was packed earth covered with creek gravel, the same drainage approach she used in her own animal pen. The livestock of all 4 families would winter in the courtyard, sheltered from the wind and the direct cold, their collective body heat warming the enclosed space. She had calculated the livestock heat contribution at approximately equivalent to a moderate fire burning continuously. 4 families' cattle, pigs and chickens in an enclosed space of 1,600 square feet, generated, by her estimate, a constant ambient temperature of 30 to 35 degrees above outside air in the worst cold. Not warm enough for people without additional heat. Warm enough to serve as a thermal buffer for all 4 corridors, which opened from the courtyard into the family cabins. The construction was complete in the first week of June. She walked the perimeter of the completed structure and stood in each corridor in turn and walked through the courtyard and looked at what the 4 families had built together and felt something she had not felt since Peder died, which was the specific satisfaction of seeing a design become a physical thing that worked as designed. The first test was mild, the summer proving nothing except that the construction was sound. The autumn was inconclusive in the way that autumn was always inconclusive in Wisconsin territory. Cold enough to show that the corridors stayed above outside temperature by the margin she had predicted. Not cold enough to show what the margin meant at 40 below. November showed the first real benefit. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees on a November night, and Ingeborg walked from her cabin through the north corridor to the Svensson cabin without her coat. The corridor temperature was 38 degrees, 12 degrees outside, 38 in the corridor, 54 in the Svensson main room. She walked the full circuit, north corridor to Svensson, east corridor to Anderson, south corridor to Halvorsen, west corridor back to her own cabin, and the temperatures matched what she had calculated to within 2 degrees on every leg. She wrote the numbers in her ledger that night with the precision of a scientist and the satisfaction of a woman who had spent 2 years being told the idea was foolish and had decided to build the answer rather than argue about it. December brought a cold snap that ran for 10 days and produced the first real comparison data. The 4 families in the connected cluster burned a total of 11 cord of wood in December. The 4 families who were not in the cluster, the Pedersen, Johansson, Magnusson, and Reinholdt, claims in the western section of the settlement, burned a collective 22 cord for the same 10 cold days. 11 versus 22. The connected structure used exactly half the fuel of 4 equivalent-size individual cabins. Ingeborg did not announce this finding publicly. She wrote it in the ledger and waited for people to ask. People asked in January, when the fuel arithmetic became the universal concern of the settlement, and the question of how the eastern section families were managing to stay warm became something people mentioned at the trading post. And as Anderson mentioned, to the man behind him in the queue at the trading post in the second week of January, that his family had burned through less wood in the entire first half of winter than he had burned in December of the previous year alone. He mentioned it the way a man mentioned something that was true and that he thought was worth knowing, without drama. The man behind him was Martin Johansson, whose family was on its third heavy cold snap of the season, and whose wood supply was being managed with the careful anxiety of someone who understood they might not make February without a shortfall. He said, "How?" Anders said, "We connected the cabins." Martin said, "What does that mean?" Anders described the corridors and the courtyard in plain terms, the shared walls, the corridor as thermal buffer, the livestock in the enclosed courtyard. Martin listened with the attention of a man in whom urgency had replaced skepticism. He said, "Who designed this?" Anders said, "Ingeborg Dahl. It was her design. She has been trying to explain it since September of last year." Martin was quiet for a moment. He said, "I remember that. Someone mentioned it at church. I thought it was a widow woman's idea." Anders looked at him with an expression that said several things without saying any of them. Martin said, "Where is Mrs. Dahl?" Ingeborg was at the dry goods counter. Martin said, "I heard what you built. Can it be done with cabins that are not in a square arrangement?" She looked at him. She said, "What is your arrangement?" He described the positions of the 4 western section claims. They were not in a square. They were in a rough L shape, 2 cabins on the east side of the western section running north-south, 1 cabin set back to the west, 1 cabin at the southwest corner. Not ideal for the courtyard model, but workable with modification. She said, "The corridor principle applies to any arrangement. You don't need a square. You need shared walls and enclosed transition spaces. The courtyard is the most efficient configuration, but it is not the only one." He said, "Can you show me what it would look like?" She said, "Come by on Saturday, I'll draw it for you." He came on Saturday with 2 of the other 3 western section families, the Reinhold couple and the Magnusson family. She drew the configuration on paper, a modified L-shaped cluster connecting the 4 claims in the arrangement they actually had. Not the ideal square, but a workable adaptation. She showed them the corridor dimensions, the shared wall connections, the livestock enclosure that would serve as the thermal buffer. She showed them her December numbers, 11 cord versus 22 cord for equivalent temperature and equivalent family size. Mrs. Reinhold said, "Can we use a smaller livestock enclosure? We only have 2 animals between us." Ingeborg said, "Smaller enclosure means less body heat contribution. You compensate by making the corridor walls thicker or by adding a small stove in the enclosure for the worst cold nights. The enclosure does not need to be large. It needs to be enclosed, and it needs to be connected to the corridors." Martin said, "How long would construction take?" She said, "Spring to summer, with 4 families working. Similar timeline to what we did on the east section. You have from now until April to decide and plan, and from April until October to build. That is adequate time if the decision is made now." Mrs. Reinhold looked at her husband. He was a practical man, and he was doing the arithmetic that the December numbers had already done. 11 versus 22 was a ratio that did not require long consideration. He looked at Martin, and Martin nodded. He said, "We'll discuss it with the Magnussons and come back to you in 2 weeks. They came back in 1 week. All 4 families had agreed. She drew the construction plans over February, and by March she had a full set of drawings for the western section cluster. She spent 2 days walking the western section sites with Martin Johansson, taking compass bearings and measuring existing cabin positions and checking solar angles and wind exposure. the same survey work she had done before designing the eastern section. The western section cluster went up from May through September of 1855. She directed the construction with the same precision she had brought to the eastern section, correcting the shared wall joints when Martin's crew used the wrong overlap pattern, specifying the door dimensions, designing the modified livestock enclosure for 2 animals that compensated the reduced body heat with slightly thicker corridor walls. When it was complete, she stood in the western section courtyard, which was a modified courtyard rather than a full square, more of a central L-shaped covered space, and looked at what 8 families had built from one design that she had drawn in 1853 from a letter from Norway and 2 winters of counting firewood. The winter of 1855 to 1856 was the winter that made everything clear. It was the hardest winter Wisconsin Territory had delivered since the settlement was established. The temperature dropped to -30 in early January and stayed below -20 for 12 consecutive days, a stretch that broke every previous record at the settlement's thermometer and consumed the wood supplies of every unconnected claim in the settlement at a rate that required 3 emergency community wood-cutting parties organized in January and February. The eastern section cluster burned 15 cord of wood for the entire winter. 4 families, one of the worst winters on record, 15 cord total. The previous winter, before the cluster existed, those same 4 families had burned a combined 28 cord. The western section cluster, in its first full winter, burned 17 cord, slightly more than the east, due to the modified L-shaped configuration being slightly less thermally efficient than the square. Still dramatically less than the 24 cord the same 4 families had burned the previous winter in their individual cabins. The settlement had 32 families. The 8 families in the 2 clusters burned 32 cord combined. The remaining 24 families in standard individual cabins burned a combined 168 cord. The arithmetic was not complicated, and it was the arithmetic of survival rather than convenience. 3 of the 24 individual families ran into serious fuel shortages in February and required community assistance. None of the 8 cluster families had any shortage at any point. Ingeborg did not present this data as an argument. She opened her ledger to the winter's records at the settlement's April community meeting and set it on the table and let people read it. There was a long silence after people had read the numbers. Harlan Peterson, whose family had been one of the 3 requiring emergency fuel assistance in February, said, "These numbers are correct." She said, "They are from my ledger. Every entry is dated and signed. You are welcome to compare them against your own records." He looked at the numbers. He said, 8 families burning 32 cord, 24 families burning 168. She said, "Yes." He said, "What does that mean per family?" He said, "The cluster families averaged 4 cord for a winter that typically requires 7. The individual cabin families averaged 7 for the same winter, which was why 3 of them required emergency community assistance." He said, 3 of them ran short. She said, "Yes." He was quiet. He was doing the arithmetic of the emergency assistance, the labor of the community wood-cutting parties in January cold, the disruption to the settlement's collective operation when 3 families were in crisis simultaneously. He said, "Could this be built on the western edge?" She said yes. The configuration would be different because the claims are arranged differently. But the principle applies to any arrangement of 4 or more adjoining claims. "I would need to survey the sites and draw the plans." He said, "How long?" She said, "Survey this week, plans by June, construction July through September." He said, "And the other families between the existing clusters and the western edge?" She said, "They need their own cluster or they need to connect to an existing one. I would need to see the site arrangement." The settlement meeting that had been called to discuss spring planting priorities extended by 2 hours, while Ingeborg answered questions and drew diagrams on the paper that the trading post owner had brought, because he had seen the ledger numbers and understood that this meeting was going to require paper. It required a great deal of paper. By the time the meeting ended, Ingeborg had commitments from 4 additional families to join the construction effort that summer. The Halverson-adjacent families who had been watching the Eastern Cluster's performance through the winter with increasing attention. She had a survey request from Harlan Peterson for the Western Edge configuration. She had a question from the Reinhold family about whether a 5-family cluster was more or less efficient than a 4-family cluster, to which she gave the correct answer, which was that 5 families with 5 shared walls was more efficient than 4 with 4, and that the most efficient configuration was the largest enclosed structure the community was willing to build and maintain together. Mrs. Reinhold, who had spent the entire meeting listening with the expression of a woman thinking about implications, said, "Does this end somewhere? Is there a point where connecting more cabins stops helping?" Ingeborg said, "There is a point where the corridor length between the most distant cabins exceeds the insulating benefit of the shared walls. That point is different for different configurations. For the Ridge Creek Settlement's claim distribution, I believe 12 to 14 families in a single connected cluster would be the practical maximum. Beyond that, you need either a very large central courtyard or multiple clusters connected to each other." Mrs. Reinhold said, "You have thought about this to 14 families. Ingeborg said, "I have thought about it to however many families the settlement has." There was a silence around the table that contained, in approximately equal parts, the recognition that this had always been available to them, the understanding of what they had spent in fuel and cold and emergency labor by not using it, and the particular frontier feeling that came when a solution arrived that was both simple and undeniable. Lars Svensson said, "You explained this in September of 1853. She said, "Yes." He said, "We built it in April of 1854. She said, "Yes." He said, "If we had built it in October of 1852, when you arrived at the settlement and presumably had the same design already." She said, "I did not have the full design in 1852. I had the principle. The design came from thinking about the specific claim arrangement and the specific building materials available here and the specific winter conditions of this latitude. The design was ready in the summer of 1853. He said, "If we had built it in the autumn of 1853. She said, "You would have had 2 warmer winters before this one." He said, "And 3 families would not have been in crisis in February." She said, "Probably not." He was quiet. He looked at the ledger, still open on the table, the winter's numbers clear and undeniable in her neat hand. He said, "What do you need from us to do the next phase?" She said, 6 weeks of spring labor from every family who wants to be part of the next expansion. I need the labor before the planting season takes priority. If we start in April, we can complete the critical structures before June." He said, "You have it." The expansion happened through the spring and summer of 1855, 4 more families connecting their claims to the existing clusters through new corridors and shared courtyard extensions, the settlement's eastern and middle sections becoming a single connected structure by August. The new connected families entered their first winter in the cluster that December, with the same initial experience that every family had on first entering the finished structure. The walk through the corridor in December, cold without the heavy coat that the January cold required. The courtyard livestock area warmer than any exposed animal pen in the settlement. The shared walls, each doing the thermal work that had previously required additional fire. The winter numbers for the expanded cluster were the best yet. 12 connected families, combined fuel consumption for the full winter, 37 cord. 12 equivalent individual cabin families, the settlement average, 84 cord. By 1857, 20 of the Ridge Creek settlement's 32 families were connected in one configuration or another. The remaining 12 were at the settlement's geographic extremes, too distant from the nearest cluster to connect without impractically long corridors. Ingeborg had solutions for 8 of them and was working on the remaining 4. She was 47 years old in 1857 and had been in Ridge Creek for 6 years, and her husband had been dead for 5 of them. What she had built was not technically impressive. It was corridors and shared walls and covered courtyards, the same materials as every other structure in the settlement, assembled in a pattern that had been obvious in principle for 300 years of Norwegian mountain winters, and that had required, in Ridge Creek, one woman with a ledger and enough patience to wait for January to make the argument she could not make in September. The principle she had applied was old. Shared thermal envelopes, connected structures, the reduction of exposed surface area through cooperative building arrangements, all of it was as old as the first mountain people who had decided to stop building separate houses in the cold and start building one building that housed many families. What was new was the application and the documentation and the systematic approach that allowed her to predict the fuel savings within 5% accuracy before the first cluster was complete. What was new was the woman who, alone on a claim after her husband died, had spent 3 winters understanding the physics of what kept people warm, rather than accepting the frontier convention that cold was something you managed by burning more wood. Cold was not something you managed. Cold was something you designed against. The design was what mattered. The fire was what you used when the design needed supplementing. Lars Svensson said to her once in the spring of 1856, after the worst winter was over and the numbers were in the ledger and the community was beginning to understand what they had, "You knew this would work before you built it." She said, "I knew the principle was correct." He said, "That is the same thing." She said, "It is not the same thing. The principle tells you the design should work. The design tells you how to build it. The building tells you whether the execution was correct. These are 3 different things, and they are all necessary." He said, "You needed all 3. She said, "And I needed you to say yes in January when you said no in September." He looked at her. He said, "You needed January." She said, "I needed January to say what I could not say in September. Winter is always the better argument. I just needed the patience to wait for it." Outside the connected structure, the Wisconsin Territory spring was beginning the work it did every year. The snow receding from the south faces first, the creeks running high, the land returning to the condition it had been in before winter arrived, with its particular comprehensive lesson in what built correctly meant. Inside the corridors, the temperature was 42 degrees. Outside, it was 28. The difference was 14 degrees. In September, that had been a number in a drawing. In February, it had been the difference between adequate fuel and emergency community woodcutting parties. In April, it was just a fact. The fact of 14 degrees that the connected structure held against the outside air by the simple physics of shared walls and enclosed thermal buffers, and the 300 years of Norwegian mountain winter building that Ingeborg had read in a letter and built into the Wisconsin Territory prairie because she had needed it to be real. It was real. The numbers said so. The ledger said so. The settlement said so by the 48 families who had built corridors and shared walls and covered courtyards in the 5 years since she had arrived at the Ridge Creek trading post in September of 1851 and asked the owner whether there were any claims adjacent to hers, because she had an idea about adjacent claims and she needed to know the layout of the settlement to know whether it would work. He had said, "Are you looking to buy one?" She had said, "No, I'm looking to see whether the ones that exist are close enough to connect." He had looked at her for a moment, and then he had given her a map. If this story changed the way you think about what a community can build when it builds together rather than separately, hit that like button now and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. And tell me this, have you ever seen a simple idea that was obvious in hindsight but that nobody had applied yet? An idea sitting right there in the existing arrangement, waiting for someone to see it. That is this story. That is the frontier. Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. Ingeborg left Ridge Creek in 1869 at 60 years old to spend her final years with her daughter's family in St. Paul. She took the ledger with her. It was found in her belongings after her death in 1881, its temperature records and fuel consumption entries covering 30 winters of Wisconsin Territory data. The first entry was from her first winter alone. The last was from the winter before she left. A complete record of what the design had cost in labor and what it had returned in warmth and fuel saved and February nights that were not emergencies. The last corridor, the one between the Dahl and Svensson claims, was taken down in 1907 by Lars Svensson's grandson, who was 23 years old and thought it was a storage shed between two old buildings. He was not wrong about what it was. He was wrong about what it had been. But he had not been there in January of 1854, in -22 air, when a 7-year-old boy's eyelashes had been white and a woman had walked 40 feet in the cold and understood that 40 feet was too far. It had existed for 50 years, holding 14 degrees against the Wisconsin winter, in the space between two buildings that everyone eventually forgot had once been the warmest square of ground in Ridge Creek settlement.